The morning drive. The early morning was like a well-kept secret. The sky was still a mix of dark blue and purple, with only the faintest hint of sunlight peeking over the horizon. The world was quiet, peaceful, almost still, except for the hum of tires on asphalt as James Howard's SUV glided down the empty highway. It was a rare moment of solitude for James. The kind he had come to treasure after his retirement from the military. The world had always been so loud when he was in service, filled with the noise of orders, drills, and constant movement. Now, in these early mornings, he had the silence to himself, to reflect on a lifetime of hard-earned victories and losses, each one wrapped in the memories that had shaped him. James adjusted the rearview mirror absent-mindedly, his gaze flickering to the back seat where his most precious possession sat, well secured with a heavy leather belt. The safe. It was not just a hunk of metal, it was the vault of his life's work. Within it lay everything that mattered most, his personal documents, his military awards, and, most importantly, family heirlooms passed down through generations. Items that carried the weight of history, of sacrifice, and of legacy. He had always believed that it was these small things, tucked away in forgotten corners of life, that held the real stories. The safe, though, was more than a simple container. It was a reminder of his values, his family's history, and his duty to protect what had been entrusted to him. James' grip on the steering wheel tightened for a moment as the thought crossed his mind again, the fear that something could happen to it, that somehow the legacy he had worked so hard to protect could be lost in an instant. Over the years, he had learned not to let such fears rule him, but the safe was more than just an object to him. It was his insurance against the unpredictability of life, and in some way, it felt like a reflection of the man he had become, a man who had lived through conflict, who had learned to anticipate, prepare, and protect. The SUV hummed steadily down the open road. The landscape around him was rural and unremarkable, the kind of countryside that James used to drive through while stationed in different parts of the country. It reminded him of simpler times, before the politics, before the battles, before everything became more complicated. The fields of golden wheat waved gently in the morning breeze, while scattered clusters of trees began to awaken under the first rays of sunlight. James kept his eyes focused ahead, his thoughts wandering toward the upcoming day. He had planned to head to his cabin outside of town, a place of peace where he could spend some time organizing his collection of military records and perhaps reliving a few stories with old comrades who lived nearby. It had been a long time since he had felt the need to be among others who understood what he had gone through. In the quiet solitude of the cabin, there would be time to reflect, to think about the future, and, perhaps, to finally make some decisions about the things he'd kept locked away in that safe. But as peaceful as it was, there was a gnawing feeling of discomfort in the pit of his stomach, an unease that he couldn't quite shake. His military instincts told him that it wasn't just his imagination running wild. It wasn't something he could easily brush aside. The safe felt heavier today than it usually did, as though something was pressing down on it, and him, as they moved together down the empty stretch of highway. James couldn't quite explain it, but there it was, lingering in his mind like an unspoken warning. Perhaps it was nothing. Or perhaps, in that moment of fleeting intuition, it was a signal that something was about to change. The sound of a distant siren broke through his thoughts, the high-pitched wail growing louder as it approached from behind. James' body tensed involuntarily, his mind racing through the possible scenarios. A single glance in the rearview mirror told him that it was a patrol car, flashing red and blue. At first, he thought nothing of it. Traffic stops were routine. He had been pulled over before for minor infractions, none of which had ever led to anything beyond a polite exchange with the officer. But today, there was a difference. Today, something about this officer seemed off. James' instincts, honed from years of being alert to every possible threat, were on high alert. The officer's unmarked car signaled that this wasn't a standard patrol. As the officer's car drew closer, James' grip on the wheel tightened, and he could feel his pulse quicken just slightly. He had been in enough high-stakes situations in his life to recognize when things weren't quite as they seemed. James signaled and moved the SUV to the shoulder of the highway, his movements controlled and deliberate. He pulled over to the edge, his eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the approaching patrol car. As the officer stepped out of his vehicle, James couldn't help but notice the tall, imposing figure. The officer's uniform was sharp and crisply pressed, but it was the man's eyes that caught James' attention, cold and calculating. A quick scan of the surroundings showed nothing unusual, but something about this encounter felt wrong, almost orchestrated. The officer began walking toward James' vehicle with slow, measured steps. Every movement was precise, deliberate. As if he knew exactly what he was doing. His gaze, though, was focused on something far more specific, something in the back seat. James could feel the officer's eyes flicker to the safe, his expression hardening for a split second. There was a subtle shift in the officer's demeanor, a sudden tension in the air that James couldn't ignore. It was like an electric charge had passed between them, something unspoken but deeply understood. The officer arrived at the window and stood there for a moment, staring at James with a quiet intensity. The silence was unnerving, and James' eyes narrowed as he met the officer's gaze. He could feel the weight of something unknown hanging in the air. His military training kicked in as he straightened up in his seat, his posture disciplined, alert. "Good morning, officer," James greeted, his voice calm but laced with caution. He tried to keep his tone neutral, hoping to read the officer's intentions. The officer didn't immediately respond. Instead, he glanced back at the SUV's rear window, his gaze lingering on the safe. Then, without breaking eye contact, he asked, "What's in the back seat, General?" The question sent a chill down James' spine. He had been called a lot of things over the years, but this was different. The officer's tone was calculated, too pointed for a casual inquiry. It was as if he already knew the answer, but was testing James for a reaction. James hesitated for just a fraction of a second, his mind racing. He had never been one to lie, but he also knew that revealing too much could invite more trouble. "Just some personal effects," he replied, his voice steady. "Nothing of concern." The officer's eyes flashed with something, suspicion, perhaps, before he spoke again. "I'm afraid I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, General." Something in James' gut told him this was no ordinary traffic stop. The way the officer was acting, the way his gaze never left the safe, this wasn't just about a routine check. It was something far more deliberate. And as the officer reached for his baton, James knew he had to be ready for whatever was coming next. His fingers subtly grazed the interior of the door handle. He wasn't one to get rattled easily, but the way things were unfolding suggested that today wasn't going to be an ordinary drive. The peace he had felt just moments ago seemed to slip away, replaced by a tension that hung thick in the air. He had survived countless battles, but this felt different. This was the beginning of something much larger than he could have anticipated. The unseen threat. James had been through countless situations during his military career that could have been worse than they seemed at first glance. But something about this moment, the cold, calculating manner of the officer, the unsettling way he kept glancing at the back seat, was setting off alarm bells in his mind. His instincts, finely honed over decades of service, were screaming at him to be wary. He took a steadying breath, the sharp morning air tingling his lungs, trying to clear his mind. "Why do you need me to step out of the vehicle, officer?" he asked, his voice steady, though he couldn't quite suppress the edge of tension creeping into his words. The officer didn't answer immediately, his gaze still fixed on James with an unnerving intensity. Instead, he looked at the back seat again, his eyes narrowing just slightly. James caught the slight movement. Something was wrong. This wasn't a routine stop. It wasn't about the speed, or a broken tail light, or any minor infraction. The officer had seen something he wasn't supposed to see, or perhaps he was looking for something that wasn't there. "You're carrying something valuable back there, General," the officer said, his tone flat, devoid of warmth or empathy. There was an edge to his voice, a sharpness that didn't belong in a standard traffic stop. James felt the first stirrings of real unease. The officer's words, casual, almost dismissive, felt deliberate. He wasn't just talking about the safe in the back seat. No, this was something more. James wasn't sure what exactly the officer was getting at, but he knew the direction of the conversation was headed somewhere dangerous. There were too many unspoken things hanging in the air, things he couldn't afford to ignore. "I told you," James said, his voice still calm, though there was an underlying firmness now, "it's just personal property. Military awards, family heirlooms. There's nothing there you need to concern yourself with." The officer's lips curled into the faintest, cold smile, a look of someone who knew better. It was an unsettling smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. The tension between them thickened, and for a brief moment, the world outside the SUV seemed to fall away. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the distant calls of birds somewhere in the trees beyond the highway. Time seemed to stretch, and everything felt wrong. The officer reached into his utility belt and pulled out a set of keys, his eyes never leaving James. "I'm going to have to inspect the contents of the back seat, General. Step out of the vehicle. Now." There was something about the officer's request, the sudden urgency, that caused a surge of instinctive resistance to rise in James' chest. Every part of him screamed that he couldn't let this happen. It wasn't just the intrusion, it was the way the officer was moving, the way his eyes darted from the back seat to James, and back again, as if weighing a decision, choosing the best course of action. This officer wasn't acting alone. Something bigger was in play, and James needed to get out of this situation, fast. "Why are you so focused on my safe?" James asked, his voice lower now, a subtle challenge in his words. "What is it that you think is so special about it?" The officer's smile faltered, but it didn't disappear. He was clearly amused by James' question, as if he knew more than he was willing to reveal. "Oh, it's not about what's inside, General. It's about what's outside that matters. This is about a matter of national security," the officer said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. At the mention of national security, James' heart skipped a beat. His mind began to race. The officer wasn't bluffing. This wasn't just about a personal item or a misunderstanding. James had kept his life private for a reason. He hadn't sought the spotlight after his service, hadn't sought out recognition or a place in the public eye. Yet, somehow, this officer knew more than he should. National security? Was it possible that his safe contained something that was more than personal records and mementos? Something he didn't even realize was there? His pulse quickened as a familiar knot of worry began to form in his stomach. Was he a target for something much larger than a simple traffic stop? "I'm afraid I can't let you do that," James said, his voice finally taking on a hard edge. He was aware that his response would trigger something, but at this point, he had little choice. His body, trained to assess situations and make decisions in an instant, moved without hesitation. He wasn't about to let a stranger, or anyone for that matter, take what was his, what was meant to be protected. The safe was not just a set of heirlooms. It was more than that. He had made sure of it. The officer's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I'm not asking, General. I'm telling you." With that, the officer took a step closer, his hand hovering near his belt as he prepared to do something James wasn't about to let him do. Every fiber of his military training screamed at him to act. He didn't hesitate any longer. Before the officer could make his move, James slammed his hand onto the SUV's door handle, throwing the door open with force. It caught the officer off guard, and in that split second, James shot out of the vehicle, stepping onto the pavement with the calculated grace that had once served him well on the battlefield. The officer staggered back in surprise, raising his hand in a futile attempt to stop James. He was quick, but not quick enough. James, though not a young man anymore, still moved with the confidence and speed that came from years of intensive training. He planted his feet on the road, his military bearing visible in the way he squared his shoulders. There was no time for pleasantries or diplomacy now. He wasn't going to let this officer or anyone else cross the line. "Back off," James commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. It wasn't just the words, there was something in the way he spoke, the authority in his voice, that made the officer hesitate. For a moment, they both stood there, locked in a standoff, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The officer's hand hovered near his sidearm, his eyes flicking between James and the open safe. But James wasn't backing down. His fingers brushed the edge of his jacket, where the small emergency communicator was hidden, just in case. He knew the best course of action was to get out of this situation without escalating it further, but something inside him told him that wasn't going to be as simple as driving away. "Listen," James said slowly, taking a step closer, making his voice firm. "This is a mistake. You need to tell me who's behind this." The officer didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed again, studying James. The faintest tremor passed through his hand as he gripped his baton tighter, but there was no immediate movement. James took another step forward. He wasn't in the mood for games or threats. There was too much at stake. "Who sent you?" James demanded. "What's this really about?" The officer's silence stretched for a moment. James could see his indecision, his hesitation. He wasn't expecting this level of resistance. But before the officer could respond, a third voice, louder, more commanding, rang out from behind them. "Step away from him, now." Both men turned sharply toward the voice. James instinctively stepped back, placing himself between the officer and the new figure that had emerged from the trees bordering the highway. The newcomer wore civilian clothing, but the authoritative air around him made it clear that this was no ordinary bystander. The officer stood straighter, his grip on his baton loosening slightly as he turned to face the new figure. "Sir?" he asked, his tone less confident now. The shift in his demeanor told James everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a rogue cop, this was part of something much larger, a much more complex operation. James' hand subtly moved toward his jacket again, his instincts alert to the possibility of trouble. The figure in civilian clothing stepped forward, revealing his face. James' eyes narrowed as he recognized the sharp, almost predatory features of someone he had hoped never to meet again. It was an old acquaintance, someone who had appeared in his life under less than pleasant circumstances before. "General Howard," the man said smoothly, his smile laced with venom. "It's been a long time." The green explosion. The air felt dense with tension as James faced the newcomer. His instincts flared, every muscle in his body on high alert, ready for whatever might come next. He recognized the man in front of him immediately, the sharp jawline, the cold eyes, the air of arrogance. The last time they'd crossed paths had been years ago, during one of his more dangerous missions, where this man had been nothing more than an obstacle, a person in the way of a bigger, darker operation. It seemed that the man had somehow managed to worm his way back into James' life. "Thomas Raines," James said, his voice tight. He couldn't quite mask the distaste he felt for the man standing before him. Thomas Raines wasn't just anyone, he was an agent, an operative in a clandestine network, someone James had always known to be dangerous. He was part of a shadowy, government-linked organization, a group that thrived on manipulating information and pulling strings from behind the scenes. The last time they'd encountered each other, James had barely escaped with his life. "You've come a long way," James added, his eyes narrowing. He was no stranger to dealing with adversaries, but this wasn't just another enemy, it was a part of a system that had often made him a target for the wrong reasons. He wasn't about to make this easy for Raines. Raines' smile only widened, almost like a wolf relishing in its prey. "Always a pleasure to see you, General. Though I must admit, I didn't expect to find you in such a tense situation." His eyes flicked to the officer, who was still standing stiffly beside the SUV, his hands shaking slightly from the earlier confrontation. The officer, now covered in bright green paint, looked a mess, his uniform ruined, his authority shattered in an instant. He was no longer the confident enforcer James had initially seen, but instead a broken figure who now seemed to be caught between following orders and facing the consequences of his actions. The officer glanced nervously at Rains, who gave him a subtle nod, signaling for him to stand down. There was no need to speak further. The situation had escalated far beyond what the officer had anticipated, and it was now in Rains' hands. James didn't move, though he could feel his heartbeat pick up in anticipation of whatever might unfold next. He knew that Rains was never alone, he was always backed by a network of loyal operatives, people who were as dangerous as they were loyal. What James didn't know was what Rains had in mind this time, what brought him back into the picture and why he was so intent on the contents of that safe. The safe, Rains said, turning his gaze to the back seat of the SUV. His voice was almost casual, but there was something behind the words, a thread of menace that hinted at a deeper, darker motive. I can see you've taken precautions, General. But you must realize, there are no secrets that stay hidden forever. James stiffened. The tone in Rains' voice sent a cold shiver down his spine. There was something about the way he spoke, something that made it clear he wasn't here to ask questions, but to extract information. What's inside is none of your concern, James responded, his voice colder now. He could feel his hand instinctively tighten at his side, knowing the risks, the history, the consequences of letting this go any further. He had been in enough tight spots to know that whatever was happening now was part of a larger game, one that had been in motion long before he had even driven out onto this highway. Rains chuckled, a low sound that sent chills through the air. He walked slowly toward the SUV, his eyes never leaving James. Oh, I think it is, General. You see, that safe? It's not just some trivial personal item, is it? It holds something far more important, something that could tip the balance of power. And I'm willing to bet that you've spent more time than you'd care to admit making sure it stays locked up. James said nothing, his mind racing to piece together the bigger picture. There was no way Rains could know about the hidden compartment within the safe, the contingency plan James had put in place just in case something like this ever happened. No one knew about that. No one except James. As if reading his mind, Rains took another step closer to the vehicle, his eyes flickering to the back seat once more. He gave a signal, and the officer, still standing awkwardly at the side, moved to open the door to the SUV. James didn't flinch, though his pulse quickened. This wasn't good. This wasn't just a simple check of documents anymore. Rains was after something far more dangerous. Open it, Rains commanded the officer coldly. The officer hesitated but followed the order, stepping forward to wrench the back door open. As the door swung wide, James' eyes darted to the safe in the back seat, knowing that in mere moments, everything he had worked so hard to protect could be exposed. But as the officer reached for the safe, everything changed in an instant. There was a loud, mechanical hiss that shattered the tension in the air, and before anyone could react, a burst of green paint exploded from the safe with a deafening, violent spray. The force of the blast sent a cloud of indelible, toxic green paint splattering in every direction, the thick liquid coating everything in its path. The officer screamed in shock as the green mist enveloped him, splashing across his uniform, his face, and his hands. His vision was clouded, the thick paint dripping down in streaks. He stumbled backward, his hands raised in a futile attempt to shield himself from the spray, but the more he tried, the more he was marked. The bright green pigment quickly covered him head to toe, transforming his once pristine uniform into a garish mess of color. "No," the officer cried, his voice muffled by the thickness of the paint, but his desperation was clear. He spun around, wiping frantically at his face, but it was no use, the paint had adhered too quickly, smearing across his skin and clothes, marking him for the entire world to see. It was an indelible signal, a message that couldn't be erased. Rains, momentarily caught off guard by the eruption of paint, stepped back with a sharp exhale. His eyes widened in surprise, but the shock quickly turned to a cold, calculating rage. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, but his gaze never wavered from the officer. There was something methodical in Rain's movements now, as if he had expected this to happen, but hadn't anticipated the speed with which it occurred. James stood still, his face unreadable, watching as the officer frantically tried to clear his eyes and mouth. The paint wasn't just a nuisance, it was a statement, a security measure that James had designed years ago. In his world, nothing was left to chance. The moment anyone tried to tamper with the safe, it would release the paint, marking the intruder permanently. The officer was now a visible target, a walking reminder of the failed breach. "General," Rains began, his voice cold and measured as he turned toward James. "I have to admit, I underestimated you. But you're playing a dangerous game." He wiped his own face, a dark scowl crossing his features. "You think this is over? You think this is a message? You've only just begun to realize how deep you've gotten yourself into this." James didn't respond immediately. He allowed the chaos to settle around them, his mind still calculating the situation, weighing his options. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The officer, now covered in green paint, his movements jerky and disoriented, was a mess, but Rains wasn't a man who would back down easily. Rains took a deliberate step forward, his eyes narrowing as he sized James up. "You've made it personal, General. And now, I have no choice but to make sure you understand the consequences of protecting that safe." His voice dripped with malice, and for the first time, James could see the full depth of the threat Rains posed. The game had just begun, and James knew that he wasn't the only one playing. Whatever was inside that safe, whatever secrets it held, had now become a battleground, and James had no intention of letting it slip through his fingers. As the officer continued to struggle with the paint, trying to wipe it from his eyes and mouth, James felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about protecting a few belongings, it was about something much larger. And he wasn't going to let anyone, or anything, stand in his way. But as Rains stepped closer, ready to escalate the situation even further, James had only one thought in his mind: it was time to take control. The chase. The moment Rains stepped closer, everything shifted. The air around James seemed to thicken, the hum of the morning sky fading into nothing as his mind clicked into overdrive. Rains was no fool. He knew better than to let a situation like this slip through his fingers, and James realized he had just made a grave mistake by underestimating the man's reach and determination. "Get the officer back to the car," Rains said coldly, his voice a controlled, almost emotionless command. "We'll deal with the mess later." The officer, still shaking off the green spray, looked disoriented, his uniform ruined beyond recognition, but he nodded reluctantly, stumbling toward the patrol car. The once pristine uniform was now a grotesque mix of green paint and frustration, and it was clear that his pride had taken as much of a hit as his authority. But despite his embarrassment, the officer was nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game, and James knew it. Rains was the one who mattered. He was the orchestrator, the man behind the scenes, and the one who had orchestrated this entire scenario. James' mind was racing. He didn't have much time. If he stayed, he knew Rains would make another attempt at getting his hands on the safe, or worse, escalate the situation. James had to act fast. But to do that, he needed to get away. Without thinking twice, he swung his gaze to the officer, who was now fumbling with the door of his unmarked car, his hands coated in thick layers of paint. The officer had been humiliated, and Rains' patience had clearly worn thin. James could sense it. The officer's role had ended, and now it was all about containment. The officer had failed, and he had failed spectacularly. But the green explosion had already set everything in motion. This wasn't just about being a mere obstacle anymore. This was a high-stakes game, and James wasn't about to lose. "Don't just stand there," Rains barked at the officer, his voice cold and cutting. "Get him in the car. Now." "We're not done yet." James saw the officer hesitate for just a moment. His face was painted, his movements sluggish, but the threat in Rain's voice was enough to jolt him back into action. The officer scrambled to comply, his hands fumbling as he tried to open the door to the patrol car. James didn't waste a second. He slammed the SUV into gear and floored the gas pedal. The tires screeched in protest, the roar of the engine cutting through the silence of the morning. Within moments, he was speeding away, hurtling down the highway as the trees and the roadside scenery blurred in a chaotic rush of motion. Behind him, Rain's voice was a faint echo, but it was enough to tell James that he wasn't alone. Rains wasn't the kind of person to back down easily, and James knew that the man would pursue him without hesitation. He had a plan, though. He had been through enough high-stakes situations to know when it was time to take control and when it was time to escape. The officer's unmarked car wasn't far behind. James could see the flash of its headlights in the rearview mirror, the car moving faster than he had anticipated. The officer wasn't far from getting his bearings back, and he was gaining ground. For a moment, James considered his options. He could try to outrun them, keep pushing the SUV to its limits, but that would only buy him time. Time for what? He needed more than just time. He needed a way to lose them entirely. His military training kicked in, assessing his surroundings. The road ahead was long, twisting through fields and past scattered homes, but there was an off-ramp coming up, a shortcut to a series of narrow back roads he knew would give him a slight edge. If he could take that route, maybe he could lose them. The officer's car was now right on his tail, its headlights almost blinding in the mirror, but James didn't flinch. He took the curve tightly, sending the SUV's tires screeching as he veered toward the off-ramp. The maneuver was sharp, calculated, and at the last second, he could feel the car's back end slip slightly. But he kept it under control. His instincts were sharp. He was no stranger to high-speed pursuits. The officer's car followed, its tires digging into the asphalt as it tried to match James' pace. The officer was pushing it, trying to gain an advantage, but James knew the terrain. The road ahead was narrow, the turns sharp, and the best strategy was to outmaneuver the officer. As James barreled down the narrow side road, his fingers tightened around the steering wheel. The SUV's engine roared as he took the bends with precision, knowing that if he could get just far enough ahead, he could slip out of sight. The trees along the road blurred as he flew by, the dense brush closing in around him. The officer was still on his tail, but James didn't allow himself to look back. He needed to focus on the road ahead, on the way out of this mess. For a moment, the road opened up slightly, offering a brief straightaway, and James saw his opportunity. He took it. He accelerated, pushing the SUV to its limits. The officer's car was still behind him, but the gap between them had grown. That's when James noticed something out of the corner of his eye, another unmarked car. This one wasn't far behind. He could see the flash of its headlights as it turned onto the road. There were more of them. They were closing in on him from both sides now, an ambush waiting to happen. "Damn it," James muttered under his breath, his heart rate spiking as the gravity of the situation hit him. Rains wasn't playing around anymore. He wasn't just after the safe, he was after James, and he had sent backup. They were coming at him from both ends. He had to think fast. The SUV's tires hummed against the road as he made a quick decision. If he kept going straight, he would be trapped in a crossfire. But there was another option. He slammed on the brakes, throwing the car into a sharp U-turn, sending the wheels screeching against the gravel as the SUV spun around. The officer's car behind him wasn't ready for the sudden shift in direction and nearly collided with a nearby tree as it struggled to follow. But James was already accelerating again, heading in the opposite direction now, pushing the SUV to its max. He was back on the main road, but the chase was far from over. He could still hear the screeching tires, the distant sound of sirens, but he was hoping the sudden shift would buy him enough time to lose them in the next stretch of dense trees. The adrenaline coursing through his veins felt like fire as he navigated the back roads. This wasn't just a chase anymore. It wasn't about outrunning a patrol car or avoiding capture, it was a matter of survival. He had no intention of letting Rains, or anyone else for that matter, get their hands on the safe. They had underestimated him once before, but now, the stakes were too high. He would not let them win. For miles, it was a blur, sharp turns, high speeds, and the constant roar of the SUV's engine as it tore through the countryside. The air was thick with the scent of burning rubber and the fear that came from knowing that any wrong move could lead to a trap. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, James could feel the tension ease slightly. He had done it. For now, at least. The officer's car had fallen behind, and Rain's backup had lost ground. James didn't slow down. He didn't stop. Not yet. As he looked ahead, he saw a fork in the road. A decision point. One road led to a nearby town, and the other cut through a dense forest, an old, abandoned route James knew all too well. He chose the forest. It was narrow, winding, and would provide the cover he needed to get off the grid. With a firm press on the gas, he veered left, the SUV's tires crunching over the gravel as he disappeared into the trees. The forest closed in around him, the path darkening as the thick foliage blocked out the morning sunlight. He wasn't out of danger yet, but for the first time since the chase began, he allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. Rains was relentless, but James knew one thing for sure, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot.